there you have it. You probably never thought you could get an answer to that particular question, but there are answers for many of these questions which people tend to ask. So this evening we have Bill Hoesch. He is a geologist, and he's worked in a number of different companies, but he spent a lot of time with ICR, actually, Institute of Creation Research, down in California when they were headquartered down there. And so he did, he was the information officer for quite a long time. And now he is the director of the Creation Center that is in close to Mount St. Helens. For those of you that have been to the Creation Center before, it used to be, you go down to exit 49 and turn left towards Mount St. Helens. This one, it's about a mile west of Mount St. Helens. And I'm sure Bill's going to tell us a little bit what's all there. It's much more than was there a few years ago. He does a lot of teaching of homeschool groups there. J.D. Mitchell from Gresham, Oregon, he's donated a whole museum to that center as well. And I'm sure Bill will have lots to say about that. Bill, come on up.
Thank you very much, everybody. You know, it's very unwise to clap at the beginning of a session. Let me encourage you before we get started. This is going to be heavily visual. I recommend you sit up closer if you can. I think you're going to get a lot more out of it if you do. I hope some of my font can be even legible from back there. But in any case, thank you, Heinz, for that introduction. Thank you for the privilege of speaking here. And I really thank God for for lighthouses like this, an apologetics forum where you can get answers. You know, it can be a real wilderness out there if you're a young person, you're trying to get answers to questions, and you really got to dig. It's hard to find answers because you don't get it on your PBS programs. You certainly don't get it in your universities, and you're not going to get it from most pastors even, because they just don't feel equipped to have answers about science. And so it's really a necessary thing, and so I commend the group here. So I thank you, Ron Payne, for being here, and thank you for Ron's good partnership with the Creation Center in Castle Rock. And tonight I'd like to walk you through the events leading up to the eruption in 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, kind of the drama of the eruption itself, and what kind of lessons can you learn from an event like this. And the lessons that you can learn, if you're paying attention as a geologist, are a lot more profound than you think. It's, I think it's really underappreciated in terms of its importance. And I want to underline the apologetic importance of this as we go. I'll use a passage of scripture to do that, 2 Peter chapter 3. I'd like to give thanks to my professor, Dr. Steve Austin, Institute for Creation Research. He's the fellow that I learned so much from. And then I'd like to also give thanks with just a passage of scripture, just one of the Psalms, and before we get into the other passage, but it just says this: I like to think of this as my reason to exist at Castle Rock and at Mount St. Helens. It says this: give thanks unto the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, sing to him, sing praises to him, talk ye of his wonderful works, glory in his holy name, let the heart of them rejoice that seek the Lord. Seek the Lord in his strength, seek his face evermore. Remember his marvelous works that he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. O ye seed of Abraham his servant, ye children of Jacob his chosen. He is the Lord our God, his judgments are in all the earth. Amen. A lot of imperatives. I love the way that Hebrew people worship God. They were telling each other, to their neighbors, praise the Lord. Speak of his wonders. Tell of his great works. This is my reason for being here, to tell of God's mighty works. That's all. That's all I am as a geologist. That's all I ever hope to do. And, well, it's most of what it's what I hope to do professionally, at least. And in any case, it's really, really cool to be a part of the Mount St. Helens Creation Center. I've been there for about since what, 4 months ago? October. We started 5 months ago. And I'm brand new. I'm taking over from Pat Roy, an old friend of mine. We used to work at ICR together. And anyway, so it's really cool to be there. We do homeschool workshops with kids. We have 44 kids in each week, and we're teaching them a creation worldview class. And I'm finding it just amazing. I've never really been involved that much with youth teaching. And we got kids that are 18 years old. We got some that are 5 or 6 years old. And we got everything in between, and the moms to boot. And I'm finding that these kids are grasping a lot of information that you wouldn't expect them to grasp. If you break it up with little fun activities in between, little science experiments and things like that, man, do they lay hold of stuff. And so we've been having a lot of fun doing that. Yesterday we were doing volcanoes. We're making these kind of, with real fire, you know, it comes out of the thing. Anyway, kids light up over that. Yeah. Anyway, anything with fire, right? Yeah. Anyway, so, yeah. So look at the action verbs in this passage. Give thanks to him. Make known his deeds. Sing to him. Sing praises to him. Remember his mighty works. Remember. Why does he say remember? Because we're forgetful creatures, that's why. Yeah. And I like to think that I can be accused of taking things too literally, but he is the Lord. It says in the last passage, he is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. I wonder if that's not meant to be the geologic earth. His judgments are in the earth. The record of a watery catastrophe are written in the rocks. So let's go back to 1980. And now a lot of you young people are going to have to tune this out. I'm sorry for you. But what do you remember from around 1980? That's what I like to ask, huh? Remember 52 American hostages held in Iran? Remember that one? The Jimmy Carter administration? USA defeats the USSR in hockey. That was pretty exciting, right? In the Olympics, Ronald Reagan was president in 1981. He was first term president. John Lennon was shot in 1981. That's just some of the, I don't know, what do you remember from 1981? It's kind of fun to think about. But you know, there's other things that I remember as a geologist from right around that time, 1980-81 period. There was a former University of Washington student named Steve Austin who defended the flood at Penn State University in 1979. He stood up with a flood model for the origin of coal at your leading coal university in the world. We'll talk about that. It's remarkable what he did. 1979, also in the same year, J. Harlan Bretz received geology's highest award. Now, who is J. Harlan Bretz? He was the guy in the 1920s who proposed that eastern Washington was once underwater in recent centuries. And he was scoffed at and ridiculed for most of his life. He was 93 years old, and they marched him in front of the GSA, Geological Society of America, to give him this award. And everybody had to say, you know what, Bretz, you were right all along. Right? We were wrong, so here's your award. Here's your award, you know. It's an amazing story of somebody who persisted. He proposed that what geologists believe took hundreds of thousands of years took place in a period of months when that flood went through there. Steve Austin said, you don't need millions of years to create coal. A single flood could have done it. 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts. Nature itself does its teaching that you can explain large-scale features in the Earth's crust in a short period of time. Also at the same time, 1981 was the first time it was proposed that asteroid impact was blamed for the extinction of the dinosaurs. I think the asteroid impact was incidental. I think the flood is what kind of buried most of the bones that we see today. But in any case, large amounts of geologic work done in a short period of time. That was mind-bending to the geological community at that time. You've got to appreciate that. And it was 20 years earlier that the Genesis flood was written, and that was also a big, impactful one. But these are just some of the things that amazed me as a geologist. And something else happened in 1981. A geologist found life in Jesus Christ in 1981. That was me. all right? And somebody was not ashamed of the gospel to share it with me because I was someone who was lost. And to be lost means what? You don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're at, and you don't know where you're going. That was a pretty good description of me about 40 years ago, roughly, right? And so, but you think about the impact of Mount St. Helens, you think about these other things that happened in the area of geology, and it really was a shakeup that happened in the community. And I can just show you one graph. I got this information from a semi-recent article. If you do a word search on the word catastrophic, it's become a household word in the geologic literature. The percent of papers in a given year that use in geological peer-reviewed research papers, the percentage that word appears has skyrocketed since 1980. And so there is no longer any logical reason why anyone should reject my ideas of a global flood or reject my ideas of a young earth. There's no logical reason for that whatsoever. It's not a scientific reason that they do so. It's because the door is wide open, logically speaking. Of course, we're still ridiculed. That's all right. That comes with the territory. That doesn't bother me. But look at how the change that's happened in geology. So let's look at Mount St. Helens. And this is probably familiar to most of you, but I'll bring you through the events leading up to the eruption itself, and what kind of lessons we can learn. 5 or 6 lessons we can learn. Question I get a lot is, when we look at the earth, doesn't it just look old? Doesn't it look like the earth has got to be billions of years old? Well, when I look at things like large canyons, layered rocks, isotope rocks with large amounts of daughter product in them from isotopes, upright buried trees, formation of coal, forest regrowth, I ask myself, does it really look old? Does it really look old? Because I can explain all of these things at Mount St. Helens in a short period of time. And so where are the strong arguments for an ancient earth? Where do they exist? What is the strong reasons to believe in this? Yeah, it really gets my attention. And like I said, like I promised, I want to just take a moment or two just to look at 2 Peter chapter 3, which I think is the most important passage you can look at if you're a geologist. If you're a new believer who is a geologist, comes to faith in Christ, this is the first place I would take him, because he's got to understand something here. And this is Peter's last words to the church. And he says this, knowing this first, in other words, of first importance, above all, he's saying. And this is Peter's last words, because in the same epistle he said, I'm going to die soon, they're going to kill me, and I know it. And so he says this, knowing this first, there's going to come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of Christ coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Now, what is that? That's a funny expression. So these scoffers are going to come and they're going to say, you Christians, you keep saying that Christ is going to return. And yet, you know, the seasons come and the seasons go. The tides go in, the tides go out. The rivers run into the ocean. The processes continue. There's nothing new. It's all happening. And tomorrow will be just like today, only better. That's the attitude of the world. And that's the attitude of the scoffers in the last days. That's what Peter prophesied this now. And he goes on in verse 5, and he says, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Okay, I'm just going to stop there. It says the people are going to be willfully ignorant of 2 things, the flood and creation. The earth standing out of water and in water refers to creation, and the world that was destroyed with water refers to the flood. The 2 issues in the last days that are going to be the apologetics issues, according, not my opinion, according to Peter, he says that's going to be at the forefront, right? And doesn't it make sense that man really resents when you bring up the issue of, you know, I like to go to the university sometimes and tell people about Jesus, right? And frequently I'll get somebody who'll come up to me and say, you know what, don't waste your time on me. I'm an atheist. I believe in evolution. And you know what? It's really good to engage with these people. It's really good to do that. And I say, you really believe your ancestor was a fish? I want you to look me right in the eye and tell me that. And almost always they look away. Almost always. But once in a while they look me right back in the eye and they'll say, I do believe in that. And then I've got to give reasons for the hope that's within me. And that's why God raised up apologetics groups like this to help you guys, to give answers. We've got truth on our side. It just takes some digging, that's all. Anyway, so show me one argument for an ancient earth that doesn't rely to one extent or another on the philosophy that Peter warned about. Ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as it was in the beginning. I can read that same passage on page 1 of any geology textbook. It doesn't use those words in most textbooks, but it's the same thing. It pretends to be scientific to project present rates into the past and presume continuity into the past and presume continuity into the future, that Christ is never going to come in the future. And in the past, there never was a flood, there never was any major disruption in the natural realm, nothing like that. And they claim that as science. It's not science, it's a philosophy. It's a paganistic belief is what it is, huh? And we've got to identify this. This is the #1 apologetics issue, huh? So the last days are going to be marked by a denial of the first days. That gets my attention. And that phrase, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation, I saw that somewhere else. Several years ago, I saw this in Wikipedia, which is not the best source of information, but I happened to see this anyway. And it said this: uniformitarianism, that's this idea of continuity that you see in page 1 of any geology textbook. Uniformitarianism assumes that all things continue as they were from the beginning of the world. Now, I don't think that Wikipedia was quoting from 2 Peter. I think that when I read that, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That is like a word-for-word fulfillment of Scripture. It's only in the last few hundred years that it became widespread that people began believing in an ancient earth. Why do they believe in an ancient? Is it possible to believe in an ancient earth apart from borrowing that philosophy right there? I would submit to you it's impossible. Okay, let's go to Mount St. Helens. Let's just draw a little line under 2 Peter, and let's take a look at the volcano. Pacific Northwest, part of the Ring of Fire, Mount St. Helens, Cascade Range. There it is on the map, a little triangle there. I hope you can see my diagrams. It's going to look, some of you are far back. I hope you can make it out. You can see Mount St. Helens there, Columbia River, Portland, Yakima, Seattle. That's the rough area that we're talking about. And Cowlitz River drains into the Columbia River, and the North Fork of the Toutle is the little dinky river heading just south of, in this diagram, just south of the mountain. Anyway, what did it look like before the eruption? Some of you know what it looked like before. It was truly one of the most stupendous places in the world to go to, because that mountain stood over 6,000 feet above the level of the lake, and it literally towered over the lake. And it was just a spectacular place, and it was covered with forest all around, great big 6-foot, 8-foot diameter Douglas fir and several other species of logging trees. It was an active area, and Boy Scout camps around the rim of the lake, water skiing, fishing. This was family spot #1 for an awful lot of people, and I'm told it was just really just a great place. Anyway, get that nice tranquil picture in your mind, because it's all going to change. I hate to tell you that. All that is going to be destroyed. Here's the elevation differences: about 9,700 feet, that pre-eruption height of the volcano, and about 3,000 feet, the level of Spirit Lake. What kind of volcano is Mount St. Helens? It's called a composite cone volcano. All of your beautiful, large, cone-shaped volcanoes around the world are this kind of volcano. It's known to have a type of magma that tends to be light-colored, which means It's kind of high in silica, relatively low in metals and so on, like iron and magnesium. And the thing to remember about this type of volcano is every now and then it erupts violently, and that was the case with Mount St. Helens. The reason for that is the magma is kind of sticky, it's kind of viscous, and so the pressure builds up, builds up, builds up, and when it hits a critical level, out she blows, and it's a violent eruption. And it frequently, this kind of eruption has very little lava associated with it. We'll get to that. And the profile of the mountain looked a little bit like that before the eruption. Let's look at a little map with some geography on it just to get us a fix here. Mount St. Helens is in the bottom of the screen here. The summit of the volcano is right here. I don't know if you can see me. The mountain occupies the lower half of that whole map. And you can see there's a highway that leads up there in red. The highway followed the North Fork of the Toutle River. That's your major drainage, at least on the north side of the volcano. Spirit Lake, 6 miles to the north, roughly north-northeast, and a place called Bear Meadow, 11 miles to the northeast. These are just some of the areas I want to talk about. And the map is colored green, indicating this was a richly forested area, active logging area. After the eruption, what did the same map look like? 150 square miles of forest was toasted and toppled in 6 minutes. You know what happens when any kind of a truck collides with a 6-foot thick Douglas fir, the truck loses, right? Imagine a whole forest being knocked down in 6 minutes, just literally knocked down and then toasted. Yeah. The power is just so immense it's hard to even imagine, but it really happened, right? And the horseshoe-shaped crater is where Mount St. Helens once stood, Spirit Lake occupying a different area in space. Subsequent eruptions from the big one downcut a whole new canyon called Little Grand Canyon that became the headwaters for the North Fork of the Toutle River. I'll talk about these things as we go. So the before and the after picture looks a little bit like this. There's the before picture, there's the before, and there's the after, right? And just everything was blown down, right? And the events, I want to walk you through what the events were, but look at Spirit Lake is actually occupying a completely different area in space than what it was before, because you can get a fix from that ridge in the foreground. That ridge in the foreground tells you the picture is pretty accurate. We're same location. And just so much debris, landslide debris and other stuff landed in Spirit Lake. The whole place was destroyed. Fish, everything was destroyed. Let's go through the events leading up to the eruption. Late March 1980, the volcano was awakening after 123 years. Shallow seismic activity was detected, and a vent had opened at the top of the summit indicating heat. Early April, steam was issuing from the summit of the volcano. Look at Spirit Lake to the north, covered with snow and ice. This is a view toward the north. And mid-April, volcanic ash was coming out of the volcano. What looked like a very significant eruption after its long dormancy on April 10th. And that's a picture of the mountain. Of course, it's snow-covered. Lots of snow on that mountain in early April. And that year was no exception. You know what happens when you have a lot of heat mixed with snow. Keep that in mind, right? Late April, volcanic ash was issuing from the summit in a significant way. People along the roadside were collecting little vials of volcanic ash and selling it to the people going by. And people said, this is great fun. The volcano is awakening. And little did they know the volcano was about to go into full-scale eruption. Early May 1980, a small airplane is flying over the summit. Look at it's like the throat of the volcano is beginning to widen, like something is getting ready to go. People were warned around this time, get out of the area, something big is about to happen. We don't know what's gonna happen, but get out of the area. And because the north flank of the volcano had been bulging, had been just swelling at a rate of 3 to 5 feet per day. There was a bulge on the north side that was 450 feet out of its normal profile on the morning of May 18th. That's one of the last pictures taken from a place near to Johnson Ridge, or what's called today Johnson Ridge, named after the geologist who was there who died. In any case, anyway, that was the morning, okay. And then morning of May 18th rolls around, a beautiful Sunday morning, sunny, it's a nice day. People were out and about, people were trying to get into their homes. Other looky-loos were coming around. The state governor had warned people to stay out of the area, something imminent is about to happen. That just attracted more people, more looky-loos, because they wanted to see what would happen. And it's a nice day, let's get out and hey, this could be exciting. Maybe we'll see something big, you know. And anyway, two geologists were flying overhead in a small aircraft that morning. There's two geologists, one was named Dorothy Stoffel, and they're flying overhead, and they look down on the top of the volcano, and they say, wow, we're seeing some rocks tumble into the inside of the crater. Wow, that's cool, huh? And what they didn't know at that time was a 5.1 magnitude earthquake just shook the summit of Mount St. Helens. Moments later, they described something, in the words of these geologists, they said the whole north flank of the volcano was rippling and quaking, as if it was a bowl of Jell-O or something. Moments after that, the whole north flank let loose in the largest landslide ever captured on film. You're in the upper right, or upper left rather, you're looking at the summit of the or near the summit, and if you look carefully, you can see some steam issuing from the top there, and at the bottom you can see some steam and some ash as well coming out the bottom. That whole slab is moving at terrific speed at this point in time. It's falling due to gravity. That's the oversteepened bulge on the north side. That whole thing was ripping loose. And as it did, the water that was mixed with the magma at depth, it flashed to steam because the pressure was released. It went into a phase change from water, liquid water, to this tremendous volume expansion when it turns into steam, and that was the power of the eruption. 2.3 cubic kilometers of rock and ice were moving away at terrific speed, and these two geologists are capturing this on film.
That's probably one of the first times that steam is caught in a film at the base of a landslide. I think I've never seen that steam at the base of a landslide. I've seen water squirting out in landslides, but never steam.
Yeah, some of the I'm not sure if that's steam, but there's certainly ash coming out, and I'm sure the steam is pushing it. In any case, yeah, so you got steam power. Eventually, as this thing slides away, as it's sliding, the power of the eruption is just punching holes right through the landslide before it even finished sliding. So it's really, really powerful. From a different angle, here's what it looked like from a distance. The landslide was happening like this. So she was sliding outward like so, and as she did, these two geologists were over, they had just passed over the summit of the volcano. You can see the tail wing of the aircraft, and I'm sure they're glad they were passing over it at the moment they were and not 5 minutes earlier. Anyway, imagine seeing something like that. They actually had to take evasive action with the airplane, put it in a dive to gain speed, and they went around the backside of the volcano to get out of there, right? It'd be kind of frightful when you can see that stuff is being hurled outward faster than you can fly in the airplane, way faster. It's hard to, you look at these still pictures, and it's hard to imagine. This is a dynamic situation, right? This is 11 miles away. A guy named Keith Ronholm was camping the previous night. He had his camera out, and I've heard stories like he was just putting his trousers on or something, getting up there. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. No doubt he felt the 5.1 magnitude earthquake. That's big enough, you're going to feel it, right? And he had his camera out, and he had a good telephoto lens on it. He was taking some pictures like that. And from a distance, now it's heading northward. He's northeast, so it's heading obliquely toward him. Maybe he thought how far is this going to go? He's probably fairly safe where he was, so he took some pictures. temperature inside that cloud is well over 400 degrees centigrade. It's a northward directed, it's a sideways blast of a volcano. Whoever thought a volcano would go sideways, huh? But it did here. And probably because of that north flank that was oversteepened. Just goes to show how unpredictable these things are. And that thing, as it's heading north, that steam, it's a ground-hugging slurry of this stuff. Steam and ash and rock and everything like that. And it's literally the force of the blow, it's just toppling the force as it goes. And yeah, so the temperature inside is over 400 degrees centigrade. It's traveling at about 300 miles an hour, or 300 kilometers an hour, maybe 150, 200 miles an hour. It's moving, in other words, way faster than freeway speed. And Keith Ronholm was taking these pictures. No doubt there's house-sized boulders being hurled outward at this point. Another picture of it. Again, it's a ground-hugging slurry. It's just knocking things down, anything in its path. I don't think that camper made it, actually. I don't know. At this point, Keith Ronholm, he made a very wise decision. He got into his late model Pontiac and took off down that dirt logging road as fast as he could go, because this thing is heading toward him. And it was heading obliquely toward him, but it's still moving toward him. He took one last shot over his shoulder as he was fleeing, and this is what he saw. I mean, that's not soap suds there. That's superheated volcanic ash and steam, you know. I mean, I'm sure well, I don't know. I suspect he didn't think he'd live to talk about this, but he got off of there, and that place at Bear Meadow was just enough of a ridge that he fled northward this way, from right to left this way. If he'd have stayed there where he was at Bear Meadow, he would have been toast for sure. But it was just turned out that that ridge was just sufficient to deflect the waning energy of that gas cloud into the atmosphere. He fled northward. His car was pelted with golf ball-sized pieces of volcanic ash, and it became pitch black for him. I don't know how he could drive. He got out of there somehow. And with his camera, with his pictures, and no doubt some great stories to share with his grandchildren, right? Yeah. And after that phase, then the volcano, that only lasted several minutes. After that phase, then the volcano went into full-scale vertical eruption. And it was lifting volcanic ash into the upper atmosphere, 80,000 feet up. And it was in that phase for 9 hours that day. And that's what it looked like from a distance, right? And the energy output at any given moment, one Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb per second sustained over a 9-hour period. Boom, 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 boom. That is the power, just based on estimates, just to lift. The physics of just lifting that much mass into the upper atmosphere requires that kind of power, if you can believe it. It's just mind-blowing. The people who lived in the area, they thought the world was coming to an end, I think. Nobody was quite prepared for a volcano like this. Some great pictures. I love looking at these things. That is just inside that billowing cloud that's going upward. It's no doubt laminar flow material going straight into the upper atmosphere and just billowing on the outside. From space, look at the donut-shaped cloud defining where Mount St. Helens is, except that's not a cloud, that's volcanic ash. And by the way, what is volcanic ash? Volcanic ash is merely when you take liquid magma, hot magma, and it cools in midair into tiny dust-sized particles, you call that volcanic ash. It's not the same stuff you sweep up in your fireplace. It's quite different. And it's very abrasive. It's actually literally like little tiny pieces of glass, dust-sized pieces of glass. And so it's a little dangerous in that respect. Later on that same afternoon, ash was streamed across a 5-state region, including Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. I was in western Wyoming working on a well site. I used to work in the petroleum industry. And we were out there in a beautiful location, western Wyoming. And I remember my truck was dusted with a little bit of volcanic ash, and we had some beautiful red sunsets. And that's about all I remember. I didn't pay much attention to the headlines. Oh yeah, I heard something about a volcano, you know. I had no idea the scale of this thing. That's what it looked like from a distance. Imagine seeing that out your bedroom window, right? Yeah. Here's a number of heroic or kind of scary escapes were made. Not everybody escaped, but this guy, I don't know, apparently he's making a U-turn, which was very advisable. As the cloud advanced over eastern Washington, you got this kind of apocalyptic looks to the sky like that. Before that, and right after that, it became pitch black in most of the state of Washington. Yeah. Yakima, Washington, the street lights turned on at 12 noon that day. People were warned, stay in your homes, don't go out in the stuff. We don't know what it'll do to your lungs if you breathe it. We don't know what it'll do to your carburetor if you try to drive in it. And it was all mysterious to everybody. And people didn't have cell phones in those days. They just hunkered down and listened to the radio, right? Radio was important. Masks were worn. Pre-COVID, right? Yeah. Eastern Washington got a dusting of got it more than a dusting, got several inches of volcanic ash. And the farmers in the area, the wheat farmers and others, they were very grateful because it really, they had bumper crops for several years following the eruption because that ash, it breaks down very readily into, it's very unstable, breaks into clay, gives up its silica and other nutrients into the soil. Very good for the soil. And also it left this crater-shaped, where the mountain once stood, there was a crater like that. Before and after profile of the mountain looked a little bit like this. The landslide slid northward or toward you in that particular picture. And as it did, and the magma spent itself from inside its chamber in the earth, the mountain kind of collapsed inward, giving the characteristic crater-like shape. 400 meters of the mountain were removed. In other words, about 1,300 feet of the summit was removed. And this is remember the beautiful pristine forest we had at the beginning? This is what was left of it. Imagine that, it looked like a lunar landscape. Just to review the events again, the landslide from the top of the volcano slid northward in this view. A major segment of that landslide was deflected and went down the North Fork of the Toutle River to the right of the screen there. And it went down, it traveled like 13 miles down a relatively low gradient of the river valley. Geologists to this day don't understand how you can suspend rock over the surface of the ground for that kind of distance. This is called the mystery of the long run-out landslides. Geologists are just beginning to grapple with catastrophic processes, but it's an exciting area for anybody who's interested in research. And another segment of the landslide, so some of it was deflected to the right side there, and a major part of it went into Spirit Lake. And you know what happens when you take a large body of rock and shove it into some water? What happens? Water is an incompressible fluid. If they're kids, I like to say, you know what happens when your little brother jumps in the bathtub, right? A big wave sloshes out of the side. How big do you think the water wave was on this far side of Spirit Lake that washed up the side of the mountain? The water wave, or the tsunami is what you call that when you displace water. The tsunami was 860 feet. Can you imagine a wave? Anybody like to surf? An 860-foot wave? Are you kidding me? You know, it seems outrageous, but the scour marks were perfectly evident on the side of the mountain. And not just that, but 1 million logs were sent hurtling into Spirit Lake. The whole lake was covered with logs. Amazing, huh? Yeah, 20-kilometer run-out landslide and a 260-meter, so I put this in metric. Anyway, leaving Spirit Lake covered with logs like that. Another picture. This is probably shortly after the eruption. It looked more fresh there. And that's Spirit Lake. It looks kind of, doesn't look like clear water, does it? That's because it's covered with logs. That's why. And then eventually many of the logs settled, not all of them. You can see a lot of logs still floating today. But let's look at some of the aftermath of the eruption. What can we learn from this thing anyway? part of the landslide debris that went down the North Fork of the Toutle left a pile of rubble like this that you can actually hike through. It's called the Hoesch Trail. We actually do that on what we call our West Side Field Adventure. And we'd love to have everybody out on the West Side Field Adventure. We have a good time doing that. We had a day-long trip from Castle Rock. I begin with a presentation like I'm giving now, and then we head out on the road, and we do several stops. We have lunch at Coldwater Lake. You bring your own lunch, and we do a hike on the Hoesch Trail, and we end at Johnson Ridge Observatory, and it makes a great day. Everybody's dismissed there at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We meet at 9 o'clock in the morning, dismissed at 4. It's a great day. And we have kids and older people, and it's not a rigorous hike. It's a 3-mile loop hike. It's more like a walk in the woods, but it's a nice thing to do. Looking at the aftermath of the eruption again, the ground surface around the volcano was hot for a period of weeks following the eruption. It really hampered efforts to get in there and evaluate loss of life and loss of equipment and so on. Turns out 57 people lost their lives. Each one of them were warned to get out of the area. 2 bodies found inside this camper. Windshield was blown out in some of these vehicles by the pressure wave that passed. Amazingly, the tires they didn't pop. I don't understand that, but anyway, that's the rescue efforts by many of these helicopter pilots was just unbelievable. They went into this zone when it was really quite hazardous because all that dust blowing around with the propeller, you get that in your engine, that could crash your aircraft. Anyway, yeah, so each person had a warning, get out of the area. They didn't heed the warning. Logging camps look like this. Another camp, I'm not sure if we just saw that one. That is not a mannequin in the back of that pickup truck, right? I don't want to dwell there. Huh? The logging trucks hurled like toys. That was what was left of the forest, 150 square miles gone. Actually, it's more like 200. I need to up that number. More like 200 square miles of forest toppled. That's, it looks like so much straw, but those are big trees. There's actually, I'm sure most of you are not going to be able to see it, but there's 2 people in that image there. two people. They look like little ants in the picture. It just helps you to appreciate how big those logs were. In the interior, as you get close to the interior of the blast zone, trees were just arranged in linear fashion because of the blowdown. Sometimes shredded like this. You see just stumps that were not neatly cut, but just shredded. The biggest financial loss came in the form of mud flows. You get a lot of snow and ice mixed with hot volcanic ash. You get a mixture that geologists give a technical word for. They call it mud. And the mud flows, actually they call it lahar. That's the actual word, lahar. But the mud flows that came ripping down off the volcano were like wet concrete. Very fluid, but extremely dense and extremely powerful because it's about 3 times the density of water. And so there were like 25 bridges that were knocked out, hundreds of homes, trucks, school buses, logs, boulders, things were just sent tumbling down. Things that are not normally buoyant in water were floating in this soupy mix, but it was powerful and fast moving. And it was probably, it wasn't super hot, it was probably like bathtub warm water. That's what was left of a logging camp apparently. And this is where I believe that's the I-5 in the background. That's, I believe, where probably where the North Toutle River crosses the I-5 and just before it joins the Cowlitz. I was left to some of the homes. High mud mark you can see on some of the trees there, right? This is further down river now. And in some cases you had boulders that were rafted in the mud flow, right? And here you can see a house that's being, next slide I'm going to show you is a house that was actually being transported. It's the only little clip I've got, it's a very short little video clip. You can see a house and what happens to it when it's floating down in the flow in the North Fork of the Toutle. Here you go. What's that? Yep, hits a bridge, and I don't think there's going to be much rescue of that house there. I mean, you young people, you don't have any clue as to the scale of this thing, huh? Even I have a hard time getting my brain around it. I wasn't there to see it, but it's just phenomenal. Now we can get to some of the lessons we can learn from it. And inside the crater, about 7 years after the eruption, you're looking at rock inside the crater, and this is called the lava dome, and you have rock or magma that crystallized into rock less than 7 years earlier. It had to be, that's the true age of the rock, the age of crystallization. That rock was sampled for radioisotope dating using the potassium-argon dating method, and applying all the standard techniques, rigorous laboratory procedure and so on. It was dated to be ranging of dates between 350,000 years old and 3.5 million, indicating what? At least in this particular case, there's something desperately wrong with the potassium-argon dating method. And this is just one of the flags that gets my attention, because every time you apply a potassium, and this is considered a very authoritative dating method, every time you apply this dating method to a historical volcano, when you can compare it against the true age of the rock versus its isotope age date, it always gives exorbitantly large numbers. It's a major flag for me that tells me something is wrong with this method. And I wouldn't say it disproves it all. You can't throw, there's a lot of semi-consistent results you get from the dating methods, but there's an awful lot of contradictions too. Way more than what should be comfortable for scientists to accept, I think, in my opinion. Anyway, so it was dated to that date, but it just helps me to, you know, so the standard geologic answer from the community was what? They say, well, this was an unusual eruption. It had excess argon associated with it, and therefore it threw off our readings. Well, that's an interesting statement. Well, how do you know all of your ancient unknown rocks where you don't have an absolute age check, how do you know they also didn't have excess argon in them? You see, there's no way to test the assumptions in any of these dating methods, and they all have assumptions that are untestable. And in other words, it's a statement of faith when people say that this rock is umpteen millions of years old, or when they say we've measured the Earth's age to be 4.5 billion years old on the same authority. It's the same thing. And so I ask myself, what is the evidence that the Earth really is that old? Is radioisotope dating all you've got? Well, you know, it is all they've got. The whole paradigm hangs on a very thin thread. And because it's so abstruse and so difficult a subject and so intimidating for most people to study, radioisotope dating, oh my goodness, who could ever study that stuff? Right? To put a chicken to sleep just hearing the word, right? But if you delve into it a little bit, there's so many holes in this. It's staggering. If you just think critically as a geologist, there's lots and lots of holes in this thing. Anyway, I've got no problem questioning it. I don't say I have the evidence to overturn it, but that's okay. I don't need to. So people ask me, how old do you think the Earth is, Bill? You're a geologist. First thing I say, I don't have an inside track on that. Geologists cannot measure the age of any rock. They can't measure its, you can measure its mass, density, temperature, all kinds of stuff. About a rock, you're not going to measure its age. You have to interpret a rock's age, and your interpretation is only as good as the assumptions go into that method. And if the assumptions are no good, the numbers you get are no good, right? And it's so easy to see. And so I say I go back on a reliable historical document. I think the Bible, I don't have any good reason for rejecting the historical case in the Bible of a young Earth. I don't have any basis for rejecting any of that and claiming I have science to do so. I don't have anything that is scientific that tells me this Earth must be billions of years old. Nothing, apart from projecting present rates into the past like Peter warned about 2,000 years ago. Okay. stop preaching now. Yeah. The landslide, yeah. The debris that landed in Spirit Lake, it piled up hundreds of feet thick in this particular area. The summit of the mountain is to the left in this view. You're looking down the North Fork of the Toutle River. You can see that kind of hummocky terrain in the distance. That's the landslide debris. And there were subsequent eruptions in which mud flows came rushing off the volcano and actually sliced through this region you're looking at right here, giving you a profile of what you had. And it formed canyons like this, canyons that were cut in one day by raging mud flows, just slicing down through the debris that was deposited in the May 18th, including deposits of the May 18th eruption. And so you have a profile like this, where you can actually look at the layers, and you can identify in the bottom of the third of the picture, that's the May 18th airfall tephra, the stuff that came out of that steam and ash cloud that was rushing across the surface. So it formed that deposit. And then there was a pyroclastic flow on June 12th, which is much more dense and a much more powerful kind of one that really is akin to lava, except it's not actually lava. It's going way faster and way hotter than lava. And it formed layers of rock. That 25-foot thick section on the June 12th pyroclastic flow probably happened in a matter of minutes. We don't know. It wasn't millions of years. We know that much. And then on top of it, you got mudflow deposits from the March 19th, 1982 mudflow. So you can, look at that, you can calibrate the layers like that, and it's really kind of cool. But you notice you see layering at a fine scale, and even at a finer scale. Layered rock, wow. And even at the level of millimeters, coarse and fine, alternating layers, and yet it all happened in hurricane velocity steam and ash clouds and pyroclastic flow. I always thought to get layers required long ages. Boy, was I wrong. You go to a place like Grand Canyon, you see layered rock all over the place. How did that layered rock get there? Now, these are sedimentary rocks, that's for sure, right? But did you know the physics operating in sand and mud being transported in water is the same physics as what's going on in a pyroclastic flow? It's the same physics. What is so convincing that those layers took millions of years to form? That's what I'd like to know. I don't see anything convincing in the manner of burial of the fossils in those layers or anything like that. It's amazing. And so Mount St. Helens challenges me to think about layered rock again as a geologist. So if you're listening, it's good. Even I wouldn't care if you're a bunch of PhD geologists. I wouldn't change anything in this talk. It's the same talk. I think it ought to challenge anybody. When you have that, another lesson you can learn has to do with rapid erosion. You have a hot blanket of volcanic ash coming to rest on a snow and ice field. What's going to happen? Well, some of that snow and ice is going to blast holes through the surface, and you had a series of steam explosion pits around the foot of the volcano. It looked like little mini volcanoes around the foot for a long time. It wasn't volcanoes, it was just that liquid water blasting to the surface in the form of vapor. And it left these things called steam explosion pits. Now, these are kind of fun. And left dozens of these pits around and they're all eroded now, but you don't see it like this now, but it's about 100 feet deep, these pits. And if you look carefully around the edge of it, it looks like the Badlands of South Dakota, something like that. Something that I always heard was indication of a mature landscape hundreds of thousands of years old, right? But this formed it instantly. It didn't take hundreds of thousands of years old at all. Other things, some of the mud flows, again, that cut through these canyons included canyons like Lewitt Canyon here on the flank of the volcano that actually cut into the flank of the pre-eruption rock. Now, that's the kind of rock you can hit with a hammer and it rings. It's hard rock. That was cut in one day by mud flow. And we know that because we can see, it was historical. You could see it, right? It happened that way. From the same mud flow further down, it downcut into the volcanic debris from the May 18th eruption, forming a series of canyons that look like this. It even looks like a kind of flat top plateau and steep walled canyons like that, 100 feet deep. Looks a little bit like Grand Canyon. In fact, they call it the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle River today. That's the name of it. And it looked like this. Here's two geologists scratching their heads, looking up at it there. Doesn't take much to confuse a geologist, I'll tell you. Yeah. Anyway, I'm used to, I actually worked as an engineer one time, and I've worked with geologists and I've worked with engineers, and there's a lot of good-natured ribbing that goes back and forth. Yeah. Anyway, sometimes not so good-natured. Yeah. Anyway, if you were to transport a geologist and move him into that canyon right there, and if he didn't know better, he might think, you know, it must have taken that little stream a long time to carve that big canyon. But he'd be wrong, wouldn't he? Because that little stream had nothing to do with the origin of that canyon. The little stream was just passing through. It was a mud flow that carved that canyon one day, and the stream is taking advantage of the low valley that was carved by the mud flow, right? And so it's amazing how people can be mistaken, right? It challenges me to think about how other canyons form, like Grand Canyon, huh? You know, there's two theories for the formation of Grand Canyon. One is that it was a lot of time and a little bit of water. The other one is, no, it was a lot of water and a little bit of time. Either one would do well, actually, the little water is not going to do anything. You need a lot of water to do it, and it probably happened quickly. You'd be amazed how many geologists are on board. Secular geologists are claiming now that that thing was carved catastrophically by the overtopping of essentially a breach dam failure on the fringe of the Colorado Plateau, where that thing down cut quickly. It didn't take millions of years to do it. And yet I was taught when I was in school that it was fact, signed, sealed, delivered. That thing was carved over 65 million years. The river slowly down cutting through the canyon. And then the other theory is for the formation of Grand Canyon. There's actually three theories. The third one is that it all got started when a Scotchman lost a nickel down a gopher hole. You know, Scotchmen are very thrifty people, you know. Okay, sorry. That's pretty bad. Okay. It's my ethnic joke, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so, yeah. You know, there's another scientist in South America who studied canyons back in the 1800s. And he was looking at a canyon in Argentina. It's called the Santa Cruz River Valley. And he made statements like this, that the river, even though it's got very little power, over long ages, it could have done this work. And so he became convinced this. He was reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which introduced, which really a hard sell on this idea of uniformitarianism. The one I was talking about was 2 Peter. And he'd been reading that book, this particular naturalist on board this voyage in the 1800s to South America. Who was this scientist? You know the name. He was young Charles Darwin. That's right. Charles Darwin was looking at this river valley in Argentina. He says, you know, it's a big valley, relatively small river going down the middle of it. Must have taken that river long ages. Therefore, I'm convinced of geologic ages. He wrote this in his journal. This is young Charles Darwin before he proposed his biological theory. Later on, he completed that so-called voyage of the Beagle, went around the Cape Horn, around to the Galapagos Islands, and he began noticing the finches and the tortoises and all the other animals, and that's when he began fermenting ideas about biological evolution. He became convinced of the geologic ages first. Then he became a biological gradualist. But he was mistaken in his geology. Why? Because today we know it wasn't the little river that carved the big canyon, Santa Cruz River Valley. It was a glacial outwash flood, not unlike the Columbia River floods out here, that carved that canyon in a short period of time. That's been documented. Everybody knows it's true now. Darwin was mistaken in his geology, and therefore he was mistaken in his biology as well. How come this is not being taught in our schools? This is really, really important information, right? And don't tell me that you can be an old earth creationist and not accept evolution or vice versa. The two have always been joined at the hip, historically, logically, all around. The two are joined. I meet people all the time who say, don't confuse me with the evolutionists just because I believe in an old earth. Well, you can be inconsistent if you want to, but come on now. Everybody knows the two are joined. Sorry if I step on toes. Huh? Yeah. Other lessons we can learn from this eruption. One day, I was there in 1985, and it still looked pretty bleak out there. It was a pretty gray landscape. I was with Dr. Steve Austin. I was a graduate student. I was with a field trip. We were with about 20 other students as well. And Steve was looking down at the lake. We were eating our lunch, eating our bologna sandwich. He's looking down at the lake, and he's noticing twigs floating in the lake. Now, who cares? You know, you got to be a nerd to study things like that, right? Just joking. Yeah, I have the highest regard for him. Anyway, he began thinking about the logs floating in Spirit Lake. Not only twigs, but there's logs out there. And what happens if those logs, it's known to happen sometimes that some of the logs begin to float in a vertical fashion because the root ends tend to be a little more dense and they tend to go down. Well, this is known to happen with logs. Well, he began thinking about this, and maybe some of them actually go kerplunk and settle into the bottom of the lake in a vertical position. He took a helicopter flight over the lake. This was several years after the eruption. And sure enough, he began to detect that there's some upright floaters in the middle of the water there. That's deep water. There's a whole school of upright floaters. Another colleague of his went out in this research vessel, and they pulled this what's called a side scan sonar in the open portion of the water, and they're able to detect that down at the bottom of the lake, it looks as if you were drained Spirit Lake today, it would look as if there's a whole forest that's standing vertical on the mud in the bottom of Spirit Lake. But they weren't trees that grew there. They're trees that got settled kerplunk and went down to the bottom like that. Well, and that's one of the images from the side scan sonar. That takes some interpreting, but nevertheless, they're able to estimate that there's got to be thousands, tens of thousands of trees standing vertically down there. Steve is a certified diver. Him and his diving buddy went down underneath the log mat. They stopped to pose for the dramatic photo here. And down they went underneath the logging mat in about 60 feet of dark, murky water. Not recommended for claustrophobic divers, right? And they were able to look up and see upright floating log, and went down all the way to the bottom, and they found, sure enough, there's trees. They confirmed it. There's trees that were in the mud at the bottom of the lake, and some of those trees had their root ends that terminate very abruptly. Remember how those trees got there? That water wave sloshed up the side of the mountain, cut those trees at root level like soft butter. That's what water can do at high velocity. Well, who cares about a bunch of logs on the bottom of Spirit Lake? Well, it turns out there's another region of the world in Yellowstone National Park. And in Yellowstone is a place called Specimen Ridge. And on Specimen Ridge are these petrified upright trees standing on the side of the mountain. And I've been there. It's quite dramatic to see. And looks a little bit like this. And if you look at it, diagrams look like this from the literature, that there's a cliff face and there's layer upon layer of buried vertical trees. And what could be more natural than to interpret those as ancient forests? That one forest grew in place a long time ago, then it got buried under volcanic debris, then another forest grew on top of it, it got buried, etc. And they identified 27 different levels of forest. Well, they did some more looking at those trees after Mount St. Helens, and what did they find? There's some of the pictures of the trees at Specimen Ridge. There's a young geologist there for scale, and it's actually a beautiful place to go. And here's some of these trees standing upright like that. It's hard to imagine a truly petrified tree, essentially made of glass. But they did some more look at those trees, and they found out that the root ends terminated very abruptly, like the logs at the bottom of Spirit Lake. And they found out that there's no soil zones really connecting those one tree to another, indicating that it was an individual forest. And then finally, one student got in there to take core samples of the trees at layer 1 of the sequence and layer 27 and all layers in between. Core samples that we could get the tree ring patterns. And the tree ring patterns indicated what? That it appears as if those trees were contemporary with one another, even though they're buried in different layers. All right? So you have to appeal to something way bigger than Mount St. Helens to explain a deposit like that, because it's the considered opinion of many secular geologists that it took something like a Mount St. Helens type of scenario to do it. And so you're talking about something way bigger here, right? And it really gets your attention. It does mine. And then one more geologic lesson has to do with the origin of coal. Coal is, of course, this black substance, very important for firing power plants and so on, to get electricity, to get electric cars, right? You need to burn fossil fuels or something like that to get electricity, right? I mean, young people are, some people think you get electricity from, from the wall, No, I don't mean to be rough on the kids. Yeah. Anyway, what is coal anyway? Coal is a layered type of deposit. It looks like this in the field. It's layered, and it's mystified geologists for a long time because it's predominantly tree bark. That's the original organic material that's been converted to coal. And so the tree bark in there is what's really puzzled people. And it looks like this. And the standard view for the origin of coal is, of course, that, and it's still taught today in most schools, that coal formed in ancient swamps millions of years ago, and when the trees fell over, they got pickled in the swamp waters, and problem. We've drained modern swamps. We know what they look like. Modern swamp is not layered. Modern swamp tends to be root penetrated, which just destroys layering, and it's no great dominance of tree bark in there. It's got all kinds of mixed organics, no great dominance. Well, there was a student at Penn State University. The year was 1979. He proposed to his professors, you got it all wrong with your swamp theory. You see, there was a big flood that covered North America. And on the surface of those floodwaters, there were trees that accumulated, and those trees rubbed against each other, the bark fell to the bottom, and the bark formed a layer of tree bark-rich peat that with further subsequent burial got converted to coal. What do you think his professors told him? They said, this is Steve Austin, by the way. They said, Steve, we think your ideas are preposterous, ridiculous, and absurd, but you know what? It explains the origin of coal better than our old swamp model, so here's your PhD. Please be on your way. He graduated from the leading coal university in the world with a flood model for the origin of coal. In other words, what people thought demanded millions of years, he explained in a single year-long flood. And he had enough backbone to stand up to it. Huh? I'm sure he took some ridicule. Anyway, he's since defended this at professional coal societies, and he's got some other things to say about it because he was a former UW student. And when Mount St. Helens blew and he got his new PhD, he heard about Spirit Lake. It was covered with logs. What do you think he wanted to do? He beat feet down to the lake there and went diving again. This is a different diving episode. He went underneath the log mat this time to document what? Sheets of tree bark on the bottom of Spirit Lake. A 3-foot thick layer lines the bottom of Spirit Lake, dominated by tree bark. This doesn't prove that your ancient coal formed in this way, but it really vindicated his model, at least in one aspect, and it should be an encouragement to all young people. If you've got convictions, it doesn't matter if it's geology or whatever, if you've got convictions about the Bible being true, you ought to stand on those convictions, because God's going to reward you. God's going to bless you for standing in a dark time like we live in today. And it's really cool how this happened with Steve, and it really, and so I wouldn't be here today talking about Mount St. Helens if it wasn't for him, because he's the one who really drew attention to all this information. There's pictures of the tree bark on the bottom of Spirit Lake. He took pictures down there. Yeah. Then one more lesson has to do with the regrowth at the mountain. Imagine a lunar landscape like this, absolutely sterile. No life, no trees, no plants, no animals. Everything was cooked, incinerated, gone. What would be the first plants to come back? What would be the first animals to come back? And what would be the succession of plants and animals? The biologists were taking their bets, right? They were saying, well, we think this one, and they were all wrong. Whoever would have thought, for example, that, well, one thing that happened here, let me just give you one thing, was the prairie lupin. Prairie lupins were among the first plants to grow in there. And what is a prairie lupin? It's a member of the pea family. It's a nitrogen fixating type of plant. It can extract nitrogen from the atmosphere into its roots, and that kind of builds up the soil with nitrogen. Nitrogen is the stuff that makes things green, right? That's one of the things, right? And nitrogen fixating, and they grew, and then those things eventually died because other plants grew, and they became shaded under plants, other young trees like the alder trees, which is also nitrogen fixating. And then they died out when the big pine trees started growing. And then, you know, so it's a succession of one after the other. And the way it happened was quick, way quicker than anybody thought. And one of the reasons it was quick was because other animals, like this guy, he was one of the superheroes, the pocket gopher. The pocket gopher, when he saw that steam and ash cloud coming, he told his buddies, he says, we're not going to outrun this one, guys. We better burrow downward. And they burrowed down into the soil, waited for things to cool off, and began eventually churning the soil with the volcanic ash, with the seeds that were in the soil, and they were extremely effective farmers that really facilitated regrowth way, way faster than anyone dreamed. And they apparently multiplied, and they were really prolific in that environment. And so totally happy. Now, nobody's happy with those creatures when they're in your lawn, but at Mount St. Helens, man, they played a big role. The elk and the deer had record numbers of twins and triplets following the eruption. What happened here? How did an eruption, did it trigger their hormone system and make them more prolific? Or what is going on? Nobody knows. Many mysteries here. Entire plants changed or certain animals like the salamander changed its life cycle to a fully aquatic life cycle, when normally it would go up out of the land for a while and go into the water and up and back. What happened? Is it epigenetic change that happened? All these mysteries challenges me to do my best in thinking about what happened in Earth history following a global destruction. What happened after the flood? How did plants and animals repopulate the Earth? It's a dynamic question. It's not the usual biological questions where you study nature in equilibrium. Here you've taken nature, shifted it out of its equilibrium, and you're seeing how it springs back. It's a different kind of question. And it's a real fun research kind of thing to be involved in. So Mount St. Helens it will be an event that humbles man. I think man is not able to control a volcanic eruption like this, right? He likes to think he's in control of nature. He's not, right? And it reminds me also of the grace of God, because it says that in that same 2 Peter passage, it says that God is not willing that any should perish, but all come to repentance. God has given us the privilege to warn our neighbors round about us, to warn them while there's time to flee from the wrath to come, because there will be a judgment. Christ will be returning. It will be a sudden return when he does. Just like all the major events in Earth history were all catastrophic. The flood, creation itself was sudden. I don't think it took place over millions of years. Creation was sudden. The fall was sudden. The flood was sudden. The dispersion at Babel was sudden. Christ's work on the cross was sudden. Huh? When he said, it is finished. Huh? And when he comes again, it'll be a sudden return, right? And so we have a record in which God works suddenly. And it reminds me of the grace of God that he's given us time to flee while there's time. You know you're a sinner. If you know you're a sinner, what's keeping you from fleeing to Christ while there's time? Is there something deficient in the work of Christ that you're holding yourself back? That's a good question to ask yourself, huh? And this man here, the old Harry Truman, he was the man who lived on the shores of Spirit Lake. Harry's Lodge was the name of it. And he was the famous old guy who the officials came to say, Harry, you got to get out of here. This thing's going to blow. You're in the worst possible place to be if this thing goes. And he wouldn't budge. And he was famous for a lot of salty language to tell people off. And I like to think, I used to think this way, that maybe Harry was like a lot of people. Maybe he thought, you know, tomorrow will be just like today, only better. And, you know, I had my breakfast this morning, I'll eat my breakfast tomorrow. And everything's going to continue as it was in the beginning. And I don't need to worry about anything like that. And, you know, I kind of thought maybe that's the way he thought. And then one time I gave this same talk to a group in California. And a young lady came up and approached me afterwards. She says, I know why Harry didn't leave. I said, really? You know? And she says, Harry was my granduncle. I'm his grandniece. And I said, really? And she said, Harry didn't leave. His wife was buried on that property. And so it's kind of a bittersweet story that I think that's the reason he was kind of a codgy old, you know, kind of, anyway, kind of a hard character to deal with, I guess. Yeah. And I see the grace of God also, and just the amazing things like, this was a geologist who was stationed, he was scheduled to be at Johnson Ridge on May 18th. He got a call the day before. He had to go down to his university to finish his project, and he asked his associate to take his place, a substitute named David Johnson. David Johnson took his place. It was the morning of May 18th that David Johnson was obliterated. They never found his body. They found pieces of his camper, but he was in a bad place to be. And he's the famous one who was on the radio with radio communication to Vancouver, Washington. And his last words were, Vancouver, this is it. That's his famous words, right? And today it's the Johnson Ridge Observatory is named after him. You don't want an observatory named after you. Yeah. But anyway, a story of substitution, huh? That one man took the penalty for the other, and it turned out that the other geologist who was stationed to be there, his name was Harry Glicken, he was never the same after that. He was destroyed. His conscience was just, anyway, it's a tragic story. So David Johnson was the one, there's David there, and Harry Glicken is the one sitting in the left side. So Mount St. Helens is a challenge that goes down in history to challenge geologists to think about large canyons, layered sedimentary rocks, or layered rocks in general, petrified upright trees, isotopes, origin of coal, forest regrowth, all those things can happen catastrophically. Where, oh where, is the evidence, scientific evidence that the Earth is billions of years old? Because if it's not radioisotopes, what is it? Is it the distant starlight challenge? Is that it? I'm sorry, you're also presuming present rates into the past if you do that. It's no different. You have to presume things about the past, the continuity of the past, in order for you to come up with anything that looks like an argument for an ancient Earth. So I'm just an ordinary goofball geologist, but I don't see any evidence for an ancient Earth. And so I think all these things can happen catastrophically. There's no need for millions of years. I call myself an unrepentant catastrophist. That's what I am. And I borrowed that from Steve Austin. He says that about himself. But remember 2 Peter, Christ will come again, huh? Yes. And that promise is going to be true. He says, where is the promise is coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as it was in the beginning of creation. That's taught as a major principle of science, and it's not. It's philosophy that's dragged in the name of science to distort people's thinking into thinking that this Earth is really billions of years because we need the billions for evolution to work. If we don't have our billions, forget evolution. It's as simple as that. And we know that also that this Earth has been shaped by catastrophic forces. Little tiny cube I got there, little red cube, that's the output of Mount St. Helens. You can just barely see that thing. About 1 cubic kilometer of material was released from the Earth in that eruption. Other historic eruptions, Pinatubo, about 10 times bigger than Mount St. Helens. That was only several years later. Nova Erupt in 1912, 30 cubic kilometers, 30 times bigger than Mount St. Helens. Tambora, 18 1850, something like that, 1830 maybe, about 200 years ago, 36 cubic kilometers. Mazama Tuff here at Crater Lake or nearby us in Oregon, way bigger, all right, 75 cubic kilometers. That's further back in time. Now these dates now you're looking at 67, 30 years. These are radioisotope dates, but I think you can take them in a relative sense in this particular thing. I don't think the numbers are true. The Bishop Tuff from Long Valley, California, 760,000 years ago, supposedly, 600 cubic kilometers. What I'm getting, and some of your big eruptions in Yellowstone, way bigger than that. Do you see a trend there? The further you go back in time, the greater the intensity of the volcanic eruptions. We live in a time of grace today when there's not gigantic eruptions going on like there were at Yellowstone. And you see, we hear all the time, we hear stories, I hear things on PBS saying, you know, we're overdue for another big Yellowstone eruption. It could happen any time now. They assume that the intensity of volcanoes has been linear over time. It's not been linear, and everybody knows it. It's been exponential. It's been on exponential decrease. I think it's true, probably true of earthquakes, true of tectonic activity, true of plate movements, all that stuff. It's, you know, my physics professor in college, he had a quote. He used to say, man, he's a funny guy, but he was a really top physicist and he really a great professor. He said, mankind's greatest shortcoming is his inability to understand the exponential function. Very interesting statement, huh? Anyway, I really think it's true of a lot of us. I think it's true of geology. We need to think in catastrophic terms, and we're trained to think that everything continues as it was in the beginning. And here's the #1 apologetics issue of the age, and it's being ignored, I think, or it's not given the treatment it deserves. So Mount St. Helens formed a crater like that, Tambora like that, Crater Lake. Even Yellowstone had a caldera, the opening, the vent from which that lava spewed out. In the Huckleberry Ridge Tuff, a volcano 3,000 individual eruption, one eruption 3,000 times bigger than Mount St. Helens. If you were anywhere in North America, that thing would have ruined your whole day. So again, 2 Peter, I won't belabor that. And so, okay, sorry. So that's it, Mount St. Helens, evidence for catastrophism. I want to just let you know of what kind of activities we do. I told you we do homeschool classes, and we do that during the winter months. We're just completing a 20-week session with the young people. It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. And we do tours. This is a map. You probably can't really see much of it, of the different stops we do on the West Side tour. We do what we call a West Side field adventure, rather. And you can see these things on our website, and we'll take sign-ups. You can call us up, or we can talk about it, bring a group by. And we meet, and we individuals, groups, they gather in cars. You drive your personal car out there. You meet at the Creation Center at 9 o'clock. I give a talk about Mount St. Helens to give you the overview. Then we hit the road, and we make scheduled stops, and we teach along the way. There's lots of cool things to look at and to learn. And we end at Johnson Ridge Observatory, and we Coldwater Lake, Hummocks Trail, Johnson Ridge, and so on. And you hike among the hummocks like here, and you know, it's hard to imagine those are chunks of from the summit of the volcano that came to rest in that area you're walking through. And then we end at Johnson Ridge Observatory. And then you got the East Side Tour. And the East Side Tour, we hike down to the lake at Harmony Trail. Oh, sorry, Harmony Trail there. We go down to Spirit Lake, go out to Windy Ridge, where you actually get closer to the actual vent of the volcano than that Johnson Ridge. It's not as famous. And we also visit Bear Meadow, have lunch at Bear Meadow. And that's the Harmony Trail going down the Spirit Lake. You get to look at those logs on the shore of the Spirit Lake. Some of them are still floating. And a lot of good lessons. I've only given you just a little bit of it. There's a lot more to learn about those things. And Windy Ridge, and there's a place called Pine Creek Boulder that you can look at, this gigantic boulder that was rafted in the mud flow. And then there's the third one is the South Side Tour. And we get out to a place called Lahar Overlook on the south side, Lava Canyon, Ape Cave, and it's all a lot of fun. It's very beautiful, and it's always makes outdoor education is always easy when you're in a beautiful setting, right? And people are naturally kind of curious how things got this way, and it makes it a lot of fun. And so there you go. And so that's it. And so we'll see you at the volcano, huh? What do you think? Right. And there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. If you're thinking, trying to think of where you're going to go this summer, here are some ideas. So we'll take a few minutes to, if people have questions, you can ask them about the tours, of course, at his table in the back there. But if you have a quick question, we'll take one here.
Thank you very much. That was extremely good.
Thank you.
I would like to ask what level of coalification or petrification has been observed over the 40 years from those logs and
Okay,
the bottom of the lake.
At Spirit Lake?
Right.
Yeah, no one's observed coalification. All we've observed is that you can get a 3-foot thick, layer of bark-rich peat in a short period of time. It just helps to vindicate one aspect of Steve Austin's model. I think if it were buried under subsequent burial of lots and lots of debris, in other words, if it was actively being buried, there's a good chance it could be converted to coal. But coalification has not begun. There's no indication of that yet. I wouldn't expect it to happen in that setting. And in terms of petrification of trees, you might expect that some of those trees that are buried deeply in the ash, if it's below the groundwater table, that some of them may have begun to silicify. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. I don't have any information on that it's happened. I know this much, that when you get volcanic ash, you get it wet, it tends to, the ash will break down into clay, and when it does, it releases silica, and silica is the stuff that petrifies wood. And it's true at Petrified Forest National Park and all these other places. It could be happening there. We know this much, that to get petrification, or lithification of a fossil, any kind of a fossil, it takes chemistry. It doesn't take time. If the chemistry's right there, it can happen quickly. If the chemistry's only half there, it might take a long period of time, you see. But there's no connection between fossils and long ages. That's a complete myth. And so I like to say, not only is it improper or impolite to call old people fossils, it's also unscientific. Okay.
Yeah, this has been a question I've always wondered about the mounds that you were describing. I know in seismic events and so forth, there is liquefaction and also sand boils that come up real suddenly. Do you think that the mounds might have occurred due to the seismic movement at all? Or the other issue is when you have a large wave like that coming down, it'll force the groundwater up and come out. Is there any indication that the mounds in the southern flat part of the state that could have been formed in that type of event?
Oh, I see, yeah. Any evidence of soft sediment movement associated with the seismic activity and the water and so on? I don't know of anything like that. It could be true. I don't know. I love your question, because that was a subject of my master's thesis, had to do with sand injectites. That's what I did as a master's topic in a mapping project in Colorado, where soft sand actually under seismic activity will squirt up through layers, and sometimes embarrassingly old layers, at least for the evolutionary scientists.
I observed the Oso landslide right afterwards, and there was mounds that came up, just like that, very similar.
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to hear about it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close out the questions for now. But you'll be available at the back table
Oh,
there
sure.
and talk about the tours and other questions they may
Yeah,
have.
be
So
happy to.
again, thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Heinz.
So just to close out, I want to bring the,
Oh, sorry.
the,
Sorry about that.
for the next speaker, which I said is Dr. Bergman. And he has a large book out called Apes as Ancestors, and you'll see copies of it on the book table back there. We got a few copies left, and the other books that he's written also, you'll see them on the back table. They're in the one corner of one of those tables there. Take a look at that. Bergman is a biologist. He's actually taught a whole bunch of different topics. He's been a professor at university for more than 40 years, teaching on biology and a whole bunch of different topics. He's got a doctorate, but he's also got a number of other advanced degrees, and so he's very well educated, and he is a member of the Creation Research Society. And so he's well informed, and he just enjoys doing his research and his latter years there. You'll see some of the highlights of his career. He's also supposedly one of the 10 most educated people in the world, in particular in science. So very impressive. But he is a creationist. He used to believe in evolution, but he's come to faith. He understands that evolution just doesn't work. And so he's got a lot of knowledge, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the talks he's going to give. The one he's going to give on Friday night, the 22nd, is called Apes as Ancestors, the same title as his book. We actually call the title of the talk, Apes as Ancestors Debunked. Apes, don't worry, they're not your ancestors, and he'll explain why. And so he's got a bunch of other topics, which I'm not going to go through, but there are flyers on the back table. There's a flyer on the mini conference that he's going to do on Saturday morning. And so everything's there. There's a whole bunch of other flyers on the back, too. Another one I do want to point out to you, some of you remember Mike Riddle, who's been here a number of times. He's given classes on basic creation training. He's got a special class that he does in the summer, which is a 5-day class. It's called Creation Apologetics Training College. And there's a flyer in the back if you are interested in doing something like that. My wife and I have been to that class about 5-6 years ago now. Very, very interesting. They take about 40 or 50 people for that class, and many of them are involved in apologetics now coming out of that class. So avail yourselves of all the books out there, the DVDs. There's the table for Mount St. Helens, and there's tables for the Apologetics. Remember, if you didn't get a chance to buy this book from Kirby and Valdez from Reasons for Hope, this is an answers book that you might want to take a look at. We have extra copies available back there. So let me just bring this to conclusion. I'm going to close in a word of prayer in a minute, and just to remind you that the way we support this ministry, if you like, there are some donation boxes in the back. You can donate to that, or you can donate online as well if you wish. Father, we come to you just to thank you for this time. We thank you for Bill Hoesch's ministry down in Lake St. Helens. It's a great place for kids to go to learn about you and your creation, look for the evidence of the truth of your word. And we just pray that you would just bless the results of his ministry and be with Dr. Bergman, too, as he prepares to come here next month. We just ask for your blessings on that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.